Morning, everyone. Can we hear me okay? Thumbs? Perfect. Hope you're having a nice Sumo digital conference so far. Aren't too worse for wear from last night activities? If you are, that would be great. I am sure you're all very excited for Karaoke 101. No, I've been lied to. Does this clicker work? There we go. I've got a pointing screen. No, we are doing State of the Art today, which is a talk I have reappropriated from developed just for all of you at Sumo Group. So what are we going to cover? I want to talk a little bit about games concept art and games art, cover a bit of the history of it, why we do it, why it is what it is, where we are sort of now as an industry, and then get on to a little bit about where I think the process of doing that artwork is going to go in the future. So for those of you who don't know, I work for a part of Sumo Group called AtomHawk. It's traditionally a visual development company, which was founded in 2009. They focus kind of on concept art, although we've recently expanded into other visual development avenues, specifically technical art, which is a studio that I'm running at the moment. We work with concepts to deliver ideas from concept to completion. That's not my line, that's the company's, so you've all heard it now, so I've done my sales pitch. We have two offices. One is in Gateshead, and the other one is in Vancouver. We have a third team, which is mine, which is entirely remote. So if you'd like to chat about that later, just come and hit me up. Yes, and surprise, surprise, we have our technical art studio. Here is some of the artwork that the very talented concept team have done over a variety of different studios. So we've got character work, environment work, graphic design, UI, all kinds of stuff there. Who am I? This is the part I hate the least, or sorry, I hate the most even, so I'll power through this as much as possible. It's tough waking up in the mornings. So I used to be the creative development director for AtomHawk, so I was doing a lot of creative direction for new projects, bringing them in, and a bit of business development. In the last year, that role has changed to studio director of our technical art studio, and you may be asking, why would that happen? That's quite a sideways switch. I spent about 17 plus years working in games. I entered the games industry as an artist. So soon enough, I will be able to send my career to university, and after that, we can go for a nice drink. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in painting, drawing, and sculpting, so it's all very traditional. And there weren't lovely degrees like there are now to kind of do all the digital stuff, so I had to kind of scour the virgin internet and find some tutorials to teach myself 3D Studio Max and Photoshop. It was fun. So I've done games art, art direction, games design, creative direction. I also have worked on console, PC, handheld, mobile, and some VR experience as well, which was kind of fun. And I ran my own small indie studio from 2011 to 2017 prior to joining AtomHawk. We made a couple of mobile games. It was fun. We did not sell much, but that's a different presentation. So the big questions. What is concept and games art? A lot of people would think concept art is this. Sorry, guys. Don't worry. Lots of pretty images you see on ArtStation. Similarly, of games art. Lots of really nice quality models and renders you see on ArtStation from very talented artists. It's not that this isn't fabulous work, but the reason I'm calling this out is the function of concept art and games art is not solely to have a pretty asset. And so I think a lot of people get confused when they start talking about what they think the job is versus what it actually is. So according to the Wikipedia, concept art is a form of visual art used to convey an idea for use in, God, I'm blind today, for use in films, video games, animation, comic books, or other media before it is put into a final product. Subset of game development for games art involving process of creating artistic aspects for a video game. So what's one thing that we pull out from this straight away? Any art you're doing, whether it be concept or games art, is not just about one sole piece. It's basically going towards a product. It's going towards a bigger project, and it's part of a whole. So here's an example of some concept art at various different stages. So you can see some concept art for Mortal Kombat 11, for those of you familiar with that. We've got a nice polished piece of rendering for Raiden there up the top, but there's also some line art there to help the 3D artist do a breakout from the front and the back. But then at the bottom, however, we've done an environmental piece. This was basically for some kind of centrifuge that you had to sort of take apart in a sci-fi shooter, which I can't remember the name of, so sorry. But this one, because of the needs of the artist, essentially was done much more as line art. You just need to to communicate that idea clearly, cleanly, and so it wasn't as rendered. Then you have the same thing with the PUBG bikes there. That was actually some skins that we ended up doing. And then finally, we have a piece of art that is entirely inspirational because it was for the Adam Hawk art book cover. So the concept art is kind of flexing the different artistic muscles depending on what the need of the person who is going to be viewing it is, right? Joe Public, who's going to look at a pretty art book, does not necessarily need to have the same information as a 3D modeler making an environmental object, right? Same thing with character art and games art in general. We've got some great examples. Hopefully everyone knows these games. Horizon, Fortnite, Halo. I think that one was from Modern Warfare, and then The Last of Us as an environmental piece. So all great pieces of artwork, and undoubtedly the quality is very, very high from very big studios, but part of a larger kind of project and purpose, which we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into. So what is concept art? Initially, it was started by the Walt Disney Studio back in 1930. A concept artist is an individual who generates a visual design for an item, character, or area that does not yet exist, hopefully. I think it's really important to touch on that. Obviously, a lot of people want to make fresh artwork all the time. I think we've reached a point in creative history where most things have been experimented with, but the challenge now is rather than trying to create something entirely new from scratch, it's understanding different pieces of art styles, different sort of visual history of development, and picking the elements you want to pull together to create something fresh. Concept art is highly iterative and collaborative. For those of you who are involved with it, as with any aspect of game development, usually the first thing you draw is not the thing that you end up with. You do lots of different sketches, color roughs, and you slowly funnel your way towards a final output, which 3 months down the later will probably be redesigned anyway. Such is the process, but it's a really collaborative kind of business, which I think is one of the great things about making games in general. It can be inspirational or descriptive. A lot of the artists I know tend to want to lean towards inspirational. They want to do the really cool artwork that someone looks at and goes, wow. But more often than not, in the purpose of games, it needs to be pretty descriptive. So you want a bit of both, because ultimately someone has to make this thing, and it's usually not the concept artist. On the games art side, for those, I think there are a few people who will remember this. We're live for this. Here we go. Early 1980s, art began to become more intricate. So we went from Pong to Pac-Man, which was a big jump. We started to see some nice arcade games, motocross, other things kind of happening there. And slowly over time, we become more and more sophisticated in the needs of game art. So we've gone into 3D in the mid-90s. It is also highly iterative and collaborative. I'm sure most of you will have worked with your leads, going back and forth on the final look dev of your 3D assets, whether it's the final proportions on the character, tweaking the textures or the shaders. You know, there's a lot of back and forth to land at your final result. One of the key differences between game art and concept art, however, is that games art as it stands has a huge amount of technical requirements, much more so than it did 15, 20, 30 years ago. Going back to that, for all of you who do work as games artists here, I am sure you all have your different specialties. And when you think about the amount of different processes and techniques you guys have to use to get to your final asset, different modeling techniques, unwrapping, rigging, exporting, bake your normal maps, cleaning up those normal maps, baking all the AO and cavity, getting that into Substance Painter, all of that kind of stuff until final asset. It's a lot of steps compared to drawing some pixels, right? And I think technically part of the issue we've had as an industry is that it's a large technical barrier for new people to come in. They can't just pick up a pencil, start drawing, and go, cool, I've made a 3D character for a game. There's a lot of steps to go into it. So why do people do this stuff? As you can see for concept art, and this is awful for someone who works at a concept art company and sees lots of beautiful art, but the main purpose of concept art is speed. So good, I said it 3 times. It's speed, 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 and that is because the whole purpose of concept art, yes, it needs to be inspirational, it needs to be descriptive, it needs to be iterative. iterate, fail fast, as much as humanly possible, as quickly as possible, and it is the cheapest way of doing so. If I had to go and ask the teams here to go, cool, I want to see 30 concepts. If you could model them all in 3D and texture them and get them in game for me before I evaluate them, it would be a nightmare. You spend a lot of budget, you spend a lot of time, people will get very frustrated. So it's the most effective way of trialing your ideas to get to something you hope will be the final result. So the focus in concept art, as much as some artists may hate to say it, the job by and large is to serve the purpose of the piece. And you want to basically make sure it's a bit less on the craft. It's not how well do I render metal, did I draw every pore on this character. It's more about how well did I communicate what this piece needs to communicate. Is it a great gun design? Is it clear for the 3D modeler who's making it? Great. Is this a piece of marketing art? Am I communicating to the general audience what this game is? Wonderful. It's that kind of stuff. For in-game art, you're serving the game at a grander kind of scope. So hopefully, with the in-game art, you've got some consistency that allows users to have a sense of immersion, right? You're building a world they feel intrigued in, and you're hopefully improving their understanding of what kind of game they're playing. If you look at most of the games you guys all enjoy, there's a very coherent through line visually into why it looks the way it looks, how that impacts the world, how the world and the characters impact the gameplay, and all the visuals should be sort of in line. So this is just a quick slide to go through all the various points that concept art and kind of games art can interact at various stages of the process. And it's not like a one-off thing. You can have both at all points, and they can go back and forward. So you can do a bit of 3D modeling at the beginning for part of your green light pitch to sell someone on the idea of your art style with some nice concept art, and then come back and redo it all once it's been signed off. So there's a lot of different artistic skill sets being used at a lot of different points in the development pipeline that you guys can plug into. And so going into process as a kind of whole, this is one of the things that interests me the most about developing games. This is a process that I've sort of established. I am sure most of you will have developed your own. It'll probably be subconscious at this point. You've done it so many times, it's muscle memory. I like to think that it's good to have some awareness, because often, when you're just doing your work, you can get into the zone and spend hours noodling away at something, and you realize that even though that corner of the room is beautiful, you probably should have spent a little bit of time somewhere else. And so having an awareness of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what is the purpose of this piece is really critical. So what I usually break this out into is purpose. So what is the aim of the thing that I'm making, whether it's concept art, game art, asset, whatever. Who is this for? Who is the audience that's going to be seeing this? What tools, so what parts of my skill set are the most appropriate to use for this, right? And then drama is basically, how do I communicate this in the most direct way possible? I don't want to have any bells and whistles. I just want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible in the clearest way. So before I get into some examples of that, little sidebar, just plugging this book. I don't make any profit from this, but this is a book that I love. Hopefully some of you may have seen it, show of hands. Yes, Peter. Excellent. I discovered this book a long time ago. I have like 3 or 4 copies, so I can keep giving people copies. It is supposedly about understanding comics, but really for those of you who have read it, hopefully you'll agree it's actually more about the psychology of visual narrative. It dives into a lot more about the history of human kind of visual development, why we perceive certain shapes, colors, visual language, the kind of emotions they inspire, the narrative they inspire. And so I think, as games artists, let alone kind of game designers, having a fundamental understanding of the history of why we perceive things the way they are and when to kind of push and pull things is really, really critical. That's one of my favorite examples where they're kind of talking about the amount of information you actually need for someone to perceive a face as a face. You could go from something very hyper-realistic to an emoji, but the intent is still there. And so it's the kind of thing that I always sort of encourage artists I've worked with to consider when they're doing their work. It's like, yes, you could be at this end, but what's the most responsible thing to do with the time you actually have? What's going to communicate the clearest? If it's the one in the middle, please do that. So some examples of this process in action. The purpose, we're making a BFG. Who's the audience? It's definitely game players. First-person shooters who, players who think they're the chosen ones. I'm sure they all are, absolutely. The tools we have, we've got some line work, some ortho, some flat tones, three-quarter viewed rendered, and a proxy model. I'm going to give this to some 3D artists to make, do up. And then what's the final output I made? I made some nice 3D models, a clean sheet with some different orthos, and that's what we're presenting. Another example. It's management time. We need some game art. We're making a new game. What is it? I don't know, but you're going to make me happy and work it out. Who is the audience? Definitely that person. That's not saying that management doesn't have any kind of clues, but more often than not, they're not as close to the game development process as you guys might be, right? They're somewhere between the audience and a game developer. So you've got to make sure you're communicating in a way that they will understand. So what do we got? Well, we've got this green light pitch. Let's do some concept art. What are the most evocative tools I can pull out? Okay, good composition, good color and lighting, a good atmosphere, and the right level of detail. Not all the detail, just enough to get across the idea. There we have our new IP image. Something kind of inspirational. It implies a lot. It's not too defined, but it gets people excited, right? And it's something management can look at and go, ooh, tell me more. So, another example. This is not animating well. There we go. Sorry. Spoilers. Purpose. We're making 3D character for a game. The main character. Audience is definitely that person who's really enjoying himself. And the tools. All the classical game art tools. We've got our 3D modeling, our 3D sculpting, our color palette, our shaders and effect, animation, level of detail. When I say level of detail on this one, I always find it really funny when we talk to games artists and they're like, oh, yep, sculpted all those pores. Cool. How big is this character going to be on screen? 250 pixels? Wonderful. You're going to see all of those on that texture. It's not going to be mapped at all. Maybe we should be tweaking this slightly, so that people are getting the maximum benefit out of what they're seeing. But yes, that's a beautiful example from God of War. But actually, it's a really great example. If you guys go and look at more screenshots of God of War, you'll probably see that Kratos, they're going for that kind of stylized realism. He does have all his pores on him, but they're not one-to-one human scale. All the details have been magnified a little bit so that it's easier for the eye to perceive, and you're picking it up and you're seeing all that effort. You can't see the effort, no point doing it, right? So I have a slide for you of stage by stage of some concept iteration from very rough sketches, continuing with a round of feedback to some more rough sketches, down to, hey, we're using some 3D blockouts now to start moving the image forward, to a kind of final result that's a mixture of 3D and photo bashing and some paint over. Here's another example of the same process, but with an MK character. And the important thing to note about these slides is, yes, there's iteration, there's sketches, but it's not like you have to do the same thing every time. At Atom Hawk, we tweak the concept phase based on a particular project. So for example, on the NetherRealm side of things, they only do 5 black and white sketches for a character at the first round. For other clients, we might do 15, 20, 30. We do it this way because the client, Ed Boon, is not the most visual person. So he needs to see a certain level of detail to the design before he can make a decision. And so we adapt the process. And that's what you need to do with every game, with every project, with every client. So we adapted that process. He goes down to 3 that he likes. And you'll see that the final result is usually a mix and match of elements from various of the designs that the client kind of prefers. Oh, spoilers. On the 3D side of things, however, again, you could consider the development process. A lot of steps again. I'm going to do a quick sculpt. I'm going to iterate on the sculpt. Maybe some edges will be sharper. We'll get a low poly model. We'll do all of our bakes. We'll do all of our retopology. In this particular case, this was an internal test we wanted to do to kind of train some of our artists to get across the idea of supporting a character on multiple platforms. The same character was at a PC res, but also at a mobile res. So this influenced some of the design, which some of you guys might have been in the talk earlier where they were talking about stylization, right? So we purposefully chose the design where you could create clear, readable shapes You could generate it somewhat quickly, but have a nice kind of quality bar. But most importantly, when the character was yay small and had to run on a mobile, it was still intact and kind of coherent as an overall sort of look, right? So what are some current trends, that are appearing in the industry right now? And we're going to start peering forward. This is the fun part, I promise. So for concept artists, definitely more sophisticated Photoshop brushes and palettes. There's more use of 3D and games art processes in concept art than there used to be. Hopefully not news for you. And simulation and procedural tools, I think, are appearing for both games art and concept art. Asset packs are heavily being done, which makes a lot of sense because, to be honest, once you've built a trash can, I'm not sure you need to build the same trash can 20,000 times, but that's where we are. And AI tools are starting to emerge, which is definitely where I think things are going to be going in the future. So looking at some concept art examples, we've been training some of our team to do some of this work. More and more, you're seeing the processes align. So artists are getting more comfortable using software like Blender. It makes sense. They can get perspective for free. They can place assets, get a number of different kind of shots quickly, right? And present something with a slightly better visual fidelity to a client to kind of decide on before they move to the next stage. You're seeing more Blender, Substance Painter, which is awesome. ZBrush has always been part of the pipeline. I don't love it. Kitbash 3D is okay. Mixamo is obviously a fashion program, but it's being used heavily in games because it can simulate all the cloth against mannequins. You get some Daz 3D, etc. Going into the AI sphere, I know a lot of concept artists and games artists that are starting to use tools a bit like Gauguin. You might have heard of Midjourney, where you can start to feed in either different images and give it keywords that will generate an image, or you can tag a certain texture to a color and then paint that shape and it will fill that in. Or, for example, doing concept creation for the faces with something like NVIDIA's GANs there. Skip a slide. Yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this is definitely the direction of travel. So why is that the case? Well, let's look at it. When we consider making a character for a game, and this really does vary depending on the game, but I'm choosing Mortal Kombat because that's a fairly character-focused game. The characters are large on the screen, front and center. They have a high level of detail, so they're spending a fair amount of time in development. On the concept side, it's anywhere between 5 to 10 days of a concept artist iterating back and forth with the client. One artist, usually good enough. You get to the in-game side, however, and you're starting to talk about months. And you perhaps have multiple individuals. You've got someone doing the general sculpts. You've got someone doing the shaders or the texturing in Substance. You've got someone else doing the facial scans and cleaning them up and generating all the different facial expressions. You've got someone else doing the rigging. You've got someone else doing the VFX. And by the time you pull all this time in, it's anywhere from 45 days to 90 days, depending on the importance of the character, which is a lot of time. It's a lot of time when you consider that when I joined, we had a 200 polygon character with a 64 by 64 texture that you did in about a day and a half, and that was cutting edge. This was the future, people, at the time. I may or may not have done that myself. Again, for environments, and the timeline can be even bigger. You can have multiple artists doing concept art for an environment. You will definitely have a lot of people, not just artists, involved in generating an environment. You'll have the game designers who are doing their initial block out, which will probably change, and it'll change at the most inconvenient times, and you've got to go and re-art things. And so again, on average, you could probably say 65 to 100 days of manpower to get that kind of done. Why is this important? So the cost of games is rising. I'm sure that's not a surprise to most of you, but it has increased dramatically in the last 15, 20 years. The example I gave earlier, we were making characters for what was then the cutting-edge PS2, rigged in-game in about a week. Now it's taking months to get to that same stage because the client is demanding that we use the technology more and more and more. We have to up the fidelity, but we're not charging that much more for the games, which means we either have to get more people in and spend more money. You'll also have noticed in terms of general trends of the games that are coming out, back on the PS2 and the PS3, there was a lot of games. There was a lot of games coming out specifically on those devices. Now on PS5, is it? Xbox, which Xbox are we on now? There we go. Game Pass. You're not getting as many AAA. You're getting a lot of mid-tier stuff and a lot of indie stuff, but not much AAA because when they come out, they need to sell something like 10 million units a pop, something ridiculous. And it's because the cost of maintaining the scale of these super high-quality games is more and more prohibitively expensive. So that is why, coming back to the AI topic, I think we're going to start seeing some changes. So most of you will be familiar with Unreal Engine, I'm assuming. You will have seen, hopefully, the keynote from Epic. You will have seen some other stuff. They've been banding around for a while. But Epic is, I think, a good example of a company who is really pushing not just for games engine, but pushing tech in general to help overall development. And not just with Unreal Engine. They're trying to push for the metaverse, which is reality, but in a game. And so they're pursuing a lot of tech that will help with that. So photogrammetry applications, you've probably seen the one that Quixel have in beta right now, where you can go and scan any object, turn it into a PBR asset, use Quixel Bridge and bring it straight into Unreal. Their own version of Substance Painter, in case you wanted a free one. All the metahuman stuff that's happening to help make photorealistic characters. They even have modeling tools now in UE5 that are relatively decent and will only get better. What they're not tackling, however, is anything that's not photoreal. So if you're doing Gears of War, that's kind of stylized realism. Characters have pores, and the metal has kind of detail, but they're ridiculously proportioned. It's not handling that. If you're doing Sonic, it's definitely not handling that. But it's a starting point. And so the future, in my mind, is going to be more tools directly integrated into the engine. And this is just one of those classic things when you really think about it, it makes the most sense. What do artists spend most of their time on? They spend most of their time on working in other applications to eventually put in a game engine to see what it looks like and say, oh yeah, that's not quite what I expected. Can I go and tweak my texture, tweak my shader, tweak my mesh, etc. So really, the most valuable thing for us as developers, but also for the clients, is if we are working at the final source of truth. If at every moment you were working in the engine, and so you're going to be able to confidently say, this is what this thing is going to look like, that's the ideal scenario, right? Once we reach that stage, then hey, concept art, game art, what's the difference, right? You're basically being able to say, I'm going to go make some art. It's going to be concept art, but hopefully it can be used directly in the game, which would be a wonderful dream. Really, really important. I know a lot of the artists using kind of kit bashing and stuff like that. It's a great tool, especially on the concept side, to help things get up and running. However, the problem with all those systems are they're very static. So that object is that object. The textures are usually baked. They don't have any kind of parameterization around them, and so there's not really much else you can do. So I think in the future, what you're going to start seeing is smart assets. Houdini is probably a good example of applications that are starting to create this, but you're going to see more of that. You're going to start seeing more tools where I'm going to go and take a tree, and it's going to be a photoreal tree, and then I'm going to turn it into a Tim Burton tree. I'm then going to turn it into a Zelda tree, and there will be options within the editor to allow you to do that. And then finally, I think we'll start to see more AI to basically take away grunt work, right? Take away grunt work and also make it more accessible. The example I usually give to people is something like YouTube or Instagram, right? The barrier to entry is very, very low. What is Instagram? It's an application for generally posting photos, occasionally the odd video, but really photos, right? Everyone has a smartphone nowadays. They can take a picture and they can post it on Instagram. Getting it up there is super slick, quite intuitive. Even if you've never used it before, you can probably work it out. There's a bare minimum of literacy in terms of using applications that you need to have, right? And that's ultimately where I think game development is going to go. Going back to the kind of technical barriers I touched on at the beginning of game art, as an industry, we can't really afford to keep having that. It just takes too long to train people. We're spending a lot of time on stuff we really shouldn't. If you think about the amount of time you're probably setting up actors in Unreal, and checking different flags for, oh, is it got the right physics calculation? Is it shadow casting the right thing? Did I put it on the right lighting channel? Like, those aren't artistic decisions. Those are game by game driven decisions. So really, if we can have tools that handle more of that, so artists are spending more of their time using their art brains, making valuable artistic decisions, that's really what you would want. But also the side benefit of this is, if we can democratize the process because it's much more accessible to people, we're going to start getting not just much more people who can come in and do work and contribute and help make games faster, but we'll hopefully also lower the time it takes to make games, which means we'll start to see more games rather than the 3 or 4 games that have to sell 10 million every time. We can start to go back towards seeing a lot more variety in games, a lot more risk, and a lot more fun, hopefully. And for those of you who start freaking out, worrying about, well, what happens if everyone on the street can go and make a game, I would again point towards Instagram and say, everyone can take a photo. That doesn't mean that everyone is a fantastic photographer. It just means the access barrier will be low. But artists should still have a considerable leg up, right? So in the future, accessible UI UX that allows anyone to unlock their creativity in a what you see is what you get fashion. Critical. Reduce or eliminate even the need for artists to leave the engine for other software. Improve collaboration between disciplines. As an example, let's say we existed in this world with this wonderful smart tools, and you had your game designer who was working with you to build the level. They could use all their white box objects, which would be smartly tagged, to already have some kind of meaning. So for example, they could have a rectangle that we already know is going to be a tree, right? And they just place that around and tag it and say, these are all trees. This ground is going to be asphalt, over here a hill, whatever. And at the end, they press the big red art button. And the tool essentially grabs the appropriate assets and puts it together. And then they can have a look with an artist and they can start saying, well, is this kind of what we imagined? Do we like it or not? And you're getting a smoother kind of collaborative experience between the two disciplines. And also, very excitingly, if we can do this, right, it doesn't just apply for games. It applies for pretty much any kind of digital media you could do in a game engine like Unreal, which you guys will have seen. They do stuff for film with The Mandalorian. They do a lot of architectural visualization. They're even doing car design in there now. I would love to see 3D comics, where it's like you've got like a little pane, and then you can like pinch and zoom in, and you can rotate around the shot, and then swipe, and it transitions to the next one. Anyway, second sort of thing. So workflow. You're all going to be Tony Stark with Jarvis. Not yet. But that said, I do think whatever ends up being the tool of the future will have a more conversational quality to it. I think you'll be doing work, but you'll be conversing with the tool, and it will help you. So as an example, first stage. We're almost at this stage now. There are tools coming into existence that allow both games artists and concept artists to quickly go drag and drop content and essentially build like a mock-up of a scene. Not a full game level by any stretch, but build a mock-up of a scene in a few days, right? Sometimes even an hour if it's a small enough little segment, which is great. But then the next stage would be, hey, this is a really nice mock-up. We really like this for this build. You know what's popular in the market right now? Zelda's popular in the market right now. Could you make this look 50% more Zelda? Because we all know how that works. So again, ideally, you would like this tool to have this kind of concept of intelligent assets. So you could start going, okay, well, let's start with the trees. I'm going to pick a tree. I'm going to have all the data that makes up this asset exposed to me. So you can tweak the mesh. You can start tweaking the textures, the shaders on the textures. You can start tweaking post-process on that kind of stuff. And eventually you go, okay, cool, I've got a tree that I like, save. The tool will end up saying something like, cool, this is a new art style you're making. Would you like to apply this to everything else in the scene? Say, sure. Some things will look great, some things will not because you've only made one tree. But essentially what will start happening is you will go and pick select objects and you will train this tool to have the data to create a new art style. It'll all be parametric, right? And so you'll arrive at your, it looks 50% more Zelda. The client will be overjoyed, at which point they will say, could we have like the mix of what we had before and this new one? And you'll say, no problem, because there'll be a slider. And you can say, what would you like? Would you like it to be the geometry 50-50? Do you want the shaders to be 50-50? All of it? And you'll kind of go back and forth, and it'll be an engine. And at the very end, when you're happy, it'll get baked down into static objects at the time of export. And you guys will have had a really nice, profound, artistic experience with this tool. You won't have had to worry about actor classes, generating collision mesh, visibility, any of that kind of stuff. Just focus on the art. What does this mean? It's not the end for artists. All of your skills are not irrelevant. In fact, they're very, very valuable. But what it does mean is essentially, hopefully, all your art directors are already telling you this, but really, you should all be striving to essentially become art directors, right? The job will be less about your manual skill. Can I perfectly shape this spline? Can I draw this, paint this texture? Any of that kind of stuff. And it's going to be more about your artistic eye. Are you making good design decisions? Have you got a good composition for your environment? Are there good leading lines through the level? Is the color palette right? Is the lighting good? Am I evoking the intent well, right? So it'll be pure artistic decisions. So hopefully that's something that you guys aren't too terrified about. I still think there'll be a role for traditional handcrafted art, whether it be in real media or digital. You'll probably find that the people who are, like you see right now, you can go and pay to do a piece for you offline. Say, I love your art. Can you draw me a piece of concept art in this style with my custom character from WoW? You'll have the same thing. Someone saying, can you build me a 3D model of my World of Warcraft character that I can print out and then paint at home? That kind of stuff. But I think by and large, as far as the games industry, you're going to see this shift in that direction, right? Where you're all going to start to become art directors. So I would very much encourage you to immerse yourselves in your crafts, understand as much visual history and language as possible, and start to build those skills so you can take a step back and essentially be critiquing your work that way all the time, rather than focusing on the nitty-gritty of the execution, right? I got ahead of myself. And that's it. Any questions? Go for it. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Lots of questions within the question. Right. So the first one, in my opinion, I think probably the reason you're seeing a lot more of the real kind of content is because that's what most people outside of games, in terms of audience, expect as high fidelity, right? And so people are trying to chase that because most AAA games have an element of realism, and so it's just the first step in the problems to solve. So I think that will start to come first, which is what we're seeing, and then people will start to ask the questions of saying, this is great, but how do I make this look, more Disney, more Pixar? How do I start to bring in more of that handcrafted sensibility? And then they'll start to develop tools that do that. So I could certainly imagine down the line an animation tool where you have a standard walk cycle, right? And you can analyze the splines, the different keyframes, and you could have an AI add, some extra bounce to it. And then an artist starts to finesse and say, whoa, that's too much at this point in the walk. I want a little bit less, and kind of go from there. But I totally get what you're saying. And if you guys haven't seen it, it's really old now. Paperman, you guys watched that short from Disney? That was really cool. So that was a mix of 3D, and then they developed like a tool where they could draw kind of hand-drawn art that was projected onto it as splines to give it that kind of quality. So I think essentially we're going to go for realism and then recapture the rest. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I don't think there's been a stage in my game dev career where some kind of new technology hasn't come in and there hasn't been some kind of pushback. I think the biggest one I can probably remember is probably when Substance, and actually Quixel had their own version of it at the time as well, but early 2010s when that started to become a thing, all the texture artists in the universe were like, oh my God, no, this is terrible, and you will never get as good a result, and I've got my photograph library that I'm going to go and overlay and hand paint in all my textures, and it'll never be as good as that, and what are they doing? Even though it was, from my point of view, removing a lot of grunt work. Without getting too philosophical, I think it's tricky. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time investing into certain skills, and again, that's why I always sort of try to advise people to think of the product, not just the skills. It's not that creating art shouldn't be a joy, and there's no craft in what we do in games. There's a lot of it, but it's not about you, right? It's about the product, and ultimately, your one asset. There's no point in that being the most polished asset in the universe if everything else doesn't look the same standard. And so you need to have a sort of an eye about what is good enough, what's responsible for this project, where else can I kind of spend my time. And when you start to get in that kind of mindset, it drifts away from the, I need to prove I'm the best at this that I can possibly be all the time. You don't care so much about showing off that I rendered this metal. You start to look at more of like, well, there's 20 of these things that need metal, and we need to get this whole game looking this good. And so what's going to help me do that in an effective way? And I think I was pretty confident saying now most people have embraced Substance and tools like it. They use it as part of the workflow, and they don't question, do I know what the exact PBR value for the roughness of this material is? They know they're quite happy to get on. It generates an initial output, and then they give their artistic time into polishing that output because it's never perfect, right? And so it's going to be very much the same thing, but on an artistic level, I get it. It's frustrating to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of hours getting really good at something to then go, oh, well, that's not as important. But again, I try to flip that in a positive way. It's like, well, you learn other things with that time, and that is still important. I can't go into too much detail about what we're doing at our studio. We have a little bit of R&D on the side, and I can talk a bit about that. So Adam Hawk traditionally did all this kind of concept artwork, but I was talking with our MD for a while and sort of saying, hey, look, this is where I think direction of travel is. We need to be preparing our artists for it. We need to be helping Sumo Group, doing other kinds of stuff. And we set up this tech art studio that is work for hire. We do UI, UX, and tech art, but we also have kind of like a little R&D branch. So for example, can't show it to you yet, but one of the things we just did, we had a client who, if you go and look at our website, you can probably guess who. We do the ending cinematics. That are these kind of 2.5D cinematics, which is layered artwork that our concept team produces. They basically came back and said, we want you to do the next batch of endings for our next top secret title, and we need you to improve a few things. We need you to improve the consistency. What they meant by that was because there's literally hundreds of these panels, that's not one artist's work. That's several different people generating this artwork. So sometimes the art style wasn't consistent on a project that scale, right? We want to improve the likenesses to our characters and the anatomy to our character models. And so they offered our concept team, hey, we can give you Unreal, we can give you the entire game, and you guys can go and mess around with the assets and stuff, which, all due respect to our concept artists who are very talented and might be touching some surface level 3D, I think they would have had a heart attack if they'd had to open stock Unreal and just mess with that. So what we actually did was we wrote them a tool in about a couple of months where they open Unreal, press a button, and they essentially get an overlay that hides all the nastiness, has very simple functions, and basically we do a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. They can pick a character from said project, spawn it, and when they spawn it, we are automatically assigning the collisions, the correct skeleton, animations, hair, the whole kind of thing, putting it together for them. We built a really simple custom kind of control rig for them where they can manipulate it and make custom poses. They can load in-game animations. We gave them some sliders and color pickers to do a day and night system or load from the client's HDRs. And so basically we built this tool that has allowed our team of concept artists, and I think I gave them like a 30-minute training session, to go off now and generate the base for all of this artwork, which they're then going to and adding additional kind of polish to on top. And it's not full-blown AI, but it was kind of proof of concept of, can we get that philosophy to kind of work? And next step for that kind of thing is we want to evolve that further and start to put in AI in places to speed up certain elements. For example, a really obvious one would be when they do a composition for one shot. Right now they can go and add more and they can tweak the angles, but you could ask an AI to do that. You could say, here's the shot that I want. Can you give me some suggestions of different angles that you think might be nice? Oh, cool. What about this one? What about this one? What about that one? Right? Enjoy your art as much as possible. Immerse yourself in the stuff that you love, which most of you do. But I would say just try to understand the art, why you think it's successful, why you love it. Then go and look at some other stuff that maybe you haven't always appreciated as much, it's not your taste. But try to understand why it is the way it is, the visual history behind it. Absorb as much as possible. Look at the artwork and your jobs beyond just literally what you're doing. So if you're a character artist, go and spend a bunch of time looking at environments, why they exist, why they're successful, when they're not successful, all of that kind of stuff. Because I think even if you end up being a character artist in the future with these new tools that change your process in terms of what you're manually doing, it's, again, you're making a game. So it's important to sort of understand the whole and how your decisions will impact everyone else's work. I'm hoping no. I think for that kind of technology to be successful, it has to be the other way around. You have to be kind of presenting the most intuitive, accessible user interface possible, and then just taking away the grunt work and hiding it behind, so that basically you guys are just focused on the art. Yeah, I mean, you see it already. I mean, someone mentioned, is Megascans really art? Is Substance Painter really art? Like that question of what have you done, I think has always kind of been there, and it will continue to be there. But that's where I sort of say hone in. All that will happen is if everyone has access to the same tools and the barrier for creating content is low, it's just going to be about you individually. What are you bringing to the table with those tools that is unique or that is better than what someone else has done? And that's why I think like the Instagram or YouTube comparison is apt. Everyone has the ability to take nice pictures or put a video up on YouTube. Doesn't mean they're making engaging content. I would be terrible at making a YouTube video, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm being told to decapitate myself. If anyone else has any questions, I'm more than happy to chat outside.